The first time they asked me to sign the will, my father was still alive. The machines around William Kane's hospital bed hummed in steady rhythm, cold and mechanical, as if they were the only honest things left in the room. My sister Victoria stood to his left, dressed in quiet luxury, her posture composed but her eyes restless. My brother Matthew lingered near the window, hands in his pockets, pretending to watch the city skyline while calculating something far more important. And I stood at the foot of the bed, looking at the man who built the Kane name from nothing but grit and instinct. William Kane wasn't just our father. He was the foundation. The house we grew up in, the logistics company he turned into a regional empire, the land he purchased before anyone believed in its value, all of it existed because he was disciplined when others were distracted. And for 10 years, while my siblings expanded their own lives in different states, I remained here. I was the one who drove him to oncology appointments. I was the one who learned the language of medical charts and side effects. I was the one who sat through nights when breathing became work. My name is Sebastian Kane, and I have always been the quiet one. The observant one. The one people mistake for passive because I don't announce my moves. The lawyer cleared his throat softly, holding a dark leather folder like it contained something sacred. We should finalize while Mr. Kane is still clear, he said carefully. Victoria stepped closer to the bedside. Dad wanted this settled, she said gently, brushing imaginary dust from the blanket. Matthew didn't turn around. It's just paperwork, Seb, he added. Just paperwork. That phrase almost made me smile. Paperwork is never just paperwork in a family like ours. I stepped forward and took the document from the lawyer's hand. The weight of it felt deliberate. The first page was structured, precise, legal language wrapping around every sentence like armor. I read it slowly. I always read slowly. Victoria shifted her stance. You don't need to go through every word, she said. We already reviewed it. Already. Without me. Interesting. I turned the page. The machines continued their steady pulse. My father's eyes remained closed, but I knew him well enough to understand something important. William Kane never rushed documents. He built contracts brick by brick. He used to tell me, Sebastian, power hides in the details. Page 2 outlined assets. The Kane residence. The distribution warehouse. Investment portfolios. Clean, organized. Page 3 changed the temperature in the room. The primary residence was allocated to Matthew. The controlling interest in the company was granted to Victoria. Several liquid accounts were distributed unevenly. And under my name was a fixed financial amount labeled as recognition for extended assistance. Assistance. 10 years reduced to assistance. I felt something move inside my chest, but it wasn't anger. It was clarity. I lifted my eyes slowly. Victoria's lips curved slightly, the kind of smile someone wears when they believe a negotiation has already ended. Matthew finally turned from the window. It's fair, he said. Fair. That word has always fascinated me. Fair according to whom? According to the siblings who visited on holidays and posted tribute messages online? Or according to the son who postponed promotions to stay close? I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I kept reading. And then I saw it. The clause near the bottom of the third page. All beneficiaries acknowledge and accept the distribution in full agreement and without contest. Clean. Efficient. Final. That line was not about distribution. That line was about silence. Victoria folded her arms. We should finish this, she said softly. Dad doesn't need stress. Matthew nodded once. Sign it, Seb. Pressure is rarely loud. It's subtle. It dresses itself as urgency. It disguises itself as concern. I looked at my father again. Years ago, before the treatments, before the weakness, he had drafted a different version. Equal. Balanced. I remembered the conversation clearly. But over the last few weeks, Victoria had been visiting more often. Matthew had suddenly taken interest in company projections. The lawyer had made 2 private visits I was not present for. Patterns matter. And I pay attention to patterns. The lawyer placed a pen on the table beside me. If we could proceed, he said. I picked it up slowly. The room felt still, but not peaceful. Expectant. They believed grief would cloud my judgment. They believed loyalty would make me compliant. They believed the quiet son would accept what was handed to him. Instead, I leaned forward and tapped the clause gently with the tip of the pen. I have one question, I said calmly. Victoria's shoulders stiffened slightly. What kind of question? She asked. This clause, I continued evenly, does it override prior written understandings or documented contributions? The lawyer hesitated for a fraction of a second. That hesitation told me everything. Prior documented agreements can still be referenced, he admitted carefully. Victoria glanced at Matthew. Matthew's jaw tightened. Why are you making this complicated? He asked. I finally looked directly at him. Clarity isn't complication, I said. Silence filled the room. The machines kept humming. My father's chest rose and fell slowly. I lowered my eyes back to the document, reading the clause again. They prepared for confrontation. They expected emotion. They were ready for a scene. What they were not prepared for was precision. I rested the pen against the paper and smiled faintly, not out of amusement but out of understanding. They had structured everything carefully. But they had overlooked one detail. And in families like ours, one detail can shift everything. As I stood there in that hospital room, surrounded by quiet pressure and unspoken greed, I realized something important. They thought this was the end of a negotiation. For me, it was the beginning of one. And before I placed my signature on the Kane legacy, I made sure of one thing. If they wanted my agreement, it would be on my terms. Because my name is Sebastian Kane. And I never sign anything without reading every line. The quiet years they like to forget. If you only saw the hospital room that day, you would think the story began there, with a leather folder and a clause buried on page 3, but this story did not begin in that room, and it did not begin with a signature. It began 10 years earlier, the day William Kane looked at me across the long oak table in his office and said, Sebastian, strength isn't loud, it's consistent. And I didn't understand then how much that sentence would cost me. When my father was first diagnosed, the Kane house was still full of movement, meetings in the study, delivery trucks coming and going from the warehouse, Matthew flying in twice a month with sharp suits and sharper opinions, Victoria managing client relations like she was born for negotiation, and me, the middle son, steady, present, reliable. At first, we all agreed to rotate responsibilities. Victoria promised to handle medical coordination from out of state. Matthew said he'd oversee financial adjustments to keep the business stable. I said I'd stay close in case Dad needed anything physical. In theory, it was balanced. In practice, theory collapses under inconvenience. The first missed appointment was small. Victoria had a conference in Chicago. Reschedule it, Seb, she told me over speakerphone. You're closer anyway. The second time, Matthew's investor dinner ran late. You've got this, he texted. Then flights became complicated. Calendars became full. And gradually, without announcement, responsibility shifted entirely to me. I stopped correcting them. I stopped reminding them whose turn it was. Because William Kane didn't raise complainers. He raised executors. So I executed. I learned the names of nurses. I memorized prescription changes. I sat through scans and waited for doctors to explain percentages that never sounded high enough. When the treatments began draining his strength, I moved back into the house permanently. My apartment lease expired quietly. My promotion opportunity in Dallas disappeared with a polite email. Matthew called once to congratulate me on being the dependable one. Victoria posted a photo of the three of us from years earlier with the caption, "Family is everything." Family is everything. It's a beautiful phrase when you're not the one carrying it. Over time, my father began trusting me with more than errands. He trusted me with information. He would call me into his study late at night when the pain kept him awake. The Kane study smelled like leather and cedar, shelves lined with contracts from decades of negotiations. He would sit behind his desk, weaker but still sharp, and ask for updates. Not about his health. About loyalty. "Who shows up?" he asked once. I didn't answer immediately. He nodded slowly, like he already knew. "People reveal themselves when pressure costs them comfort," he said. Those words stayed with me. Meanwhile, Victoria's visits became strategic. She would arrive with organized binders and talk about long-term restructuring, about protecting the Kane legacy, about ensuring the company stayed strong if anything happened. Matthew would fly in quarterly and review projections, offering advice about expansion or liquidation, depending on the market. They were never careless. They were careful in a different way. They spoke about future control in language disguised as concern. I watched it happen gradually. Conversations that used to include me shifted into side discussions. The lawyer began visiting more frequently. Once, I came home from picking up medication and found Victoria and Matthew in the study with the door half closed. Their voices stopped when I entered. "Just reviewing estate planning," Matthew said smoothly. Estate planning. That phrase floated through the house more often after that. I didn't confront them. Confrontation makes people defensive. Observation makes you prepared. I started documenting everything, not out of suspicion but out of discipline. Receipts for home modifications to accommodate wheelchairs. Bank transfers that covered specialist consultations insurance refused to approve. Maintenance costs on the house when pipes burst in winter and Matthew was skiing in Colorado. I created folders. Digital backups. Dates. Signatures. Not because I planned revenge. Because William Kane taught me that structure protects truth. Some nights, when the house was quiet and the city lights flickered beyond the windows, my father would ask me to read documents aloud. Old contracts. Partnership agreements. Clauses he had negotiated personally. He would stop me mid-sentence and explain why one word mattered more than another. "Precision," he would say, tapping the page with a trembling finger. Never underestimate a sentence. At the time, I thought he was reminiscing. Now I understand he was reminding me. As his health declined, Victoria's tone shifted subtly. She became warmer toward me in public, praising my dedication in front of extended relatives, calling me the heart of this family. But in private, she emphasized practicality. "You don't actually want the operational burden of the company," she said once while pouring herself a glass of wine in the kitchen. "It would overwhelm you." Overwhelm me. The same man who stabilized supply chains during a recession was supposedly too fragile for responsibility. Matthew approached it differently. He framed it as inevitability. "Dad built this to scale," he said. "You're good at support roles, Seb. But leadership requires detachment." Detachment. That word echoed strangely, considering I was the one detached from my own life to keep this one intact. Still, I remained quiet. Not passive. Quiet. Because over those 10 years, something else was happening beneath the surface. My father was watching. He noticed who stayed when the pain medication wore off. He noticed who answered midnight calls. He noticed who knew the alarm code without asking. And although he never confronted my siblings directly, he began including me in smaller financial decisions. Minor adjustments. Authorization permissions. He would hand me documents and say, "File this properly." He trusted my system. And I built one. So when the visits from the lawyer became more frequent in those final weeks, I didn't panic. I paid attention. The timing. The closed doors. The careful phrasing around clarity. And when Victoria started insisting that we finalize matters while Dad was still strong enough, I understood the strategy. Finalize before weakness turns to reflection. Secure before sentiment interferes. They believed proximity equaled entitlement. They forgot proximity also builds awareness. By the time we stood in that hospital room with the leather folder open and the pen waiting for my signature, I wasn't reacting to a sudden betrayal. I was witnessing the final move in a long game. They thought I had been sacrificing quietly without learning. They thought caregiving had distracted me from structure. They thought 10 years of silence meant 10 years of blindness. What they didn't understand is this: I was never just the caregiver. I was the witness. And witnesses, when prepared, become the most dangerous people in the room. The line they didn't see coming. By the time we gathered again in my father's hospital room, the air felt heavier than it had the week before, as if even the walls understood that something irreversible was about to happen. William Kane was awake this time, his eyes open but quiet, watching each of us with that familiar stillness that used to make board members nervous. Victoria stood closest to him, her hand resting lightly on the rail of the bed as though proximity alone translated to loyalty. Matthew remained composed near the window, suit jacket tailored perfectly, confidence rehearsed. And I stood between them and the small rolling table where the leather folder waited. The lawyer arrived precisely at 10 in the morning, punctual as always, carrying documents that looked identical to the ones we had reviewed before. Identical can be deceptive. Mr. Kane has indicated he would like this finalized today, the lawyer said gently. My father's eyes shifted toward me for half a second. It was not a plea. It was not approval. It was awareness. I stepped forward and opened the folder myself this time. The pages were crisp, the language deliberate. I read every sentence again, even though I already knew what waited on page 3. Victoria exhaled softly. Sebastian, we've gone through this, she said, her voice wrapped in patience. Matthew added, there's no need to drag it out. Drag it out. Efficiency has always been their weapon of choice. Move fast enough and no one questions the foundation. I continued reading. The house allocated to Matthew. The majority share of Kane Logistics to Victoria. Liquid assets distributed with mathematical imbalance disguised as appreciation. And then the clause. The line engineered to prevent resistance. All beneficiaries acknowledge and accept the distribution in full agreement and without contest. It was a clean blade, hidden in plain sight. I let the silence stretch. The machines hummed steadily. My father watched. The lawyer adjusted his tie. Victoria's posture stiffened just slightly, the first sign of impatience. I traced the clause with my finger slowly, as if admiring its structure. I have a small clarification, I said calmly. Matthew's jaw tightened. Clarification, he repeated. Yes, I replied. This clause ensures acceptance without contest. I just want it to reflect complete transparency. The lawyer nodded cautiously. What specifically are you proposing? Victoria's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. She sensed movement beneath still water. I leaned forward, resting my hand lightly on the table. I would like this clause amended to state that all beneficiaries accept the distribution subject to any prior written agreements, documented financial contributions, and recorded caregiving investments. The room changed. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. Like a glass cracking quietly before it shatters. Matthew stepped away from the window. "Why would that be necessary?" he asked, his tone controlled but thinner than before. I met his gaze steadily. "Because clarity protects everyone." Victoria's composure faltered for a fraction of a second. "Are you suggesting something?" she asked carefully. "I'm suggesting accuracy," I answered. The lawyer flipped back through the pages, considering the wording. "Technically," he began, choosing each syllable carefully, "such an amendment is not unreasonable. It simply acknowledges any documented equities that may exist outside the distribution itself." Documented equities. The phrase hung in the air like a spotlight. Victoria inhaled slowly. "This feels unnecessary," she said. "We all know what Dad intended." I turned to her gently. "Then the clause shouldn't threaten anyone." Silence returned. My father's eyes shifted between us, unreadable but alert. The lawyer picked up his pen. "If Mr. Kane approves, we can adjust the language." My father did not speak. He simply gave the smallest nod. That was enough. The lawyer drew a single line through the original clause and began rewriting it beneath. Every word deliberate. Every phrase measured. I watched the ink settle into the paper. 10 years of receipts stored in encrypted folders. 10 years of signed acknowledgments when my father transferred funds into my account to reimburse expenses. 10 years of emails confirming that I would handle modifications to the house for accessibility. All of it documented. All of it real. And now, legally relevant. Matthew ran a hand through his hair. "This is turning into something it doesn't need to be," he said. "It's turning into something precise," I replied. Victoria forced a small smile. "If this makes you feel better, Sebastian." Feel better. They still believed this was emotional. They still believed I was reacting from hurt. I wasn't. I was aligning the structure with reality. The lawyer finished writing and rotated the document toward my father. "Mr. Kane, this amendment acknowledges prior documented contributions before final distribution is considered uncontested. Do you agree?" My father's voice was weak but steady when he answered. "Yes." One word. Quiet. Final. The lawyer nodded and indicated where signatures were required. Victoria signed first, her signature sharp and confident. Matthew followed, pressing the pen harder than necessary against the paper. Then it was my turn. I held the pen between my fingers and read the amended clause one more time. It looked simple. Almost harmless. One added sentence. One added condition. One added doorway. I signed slowly, my name flowing across the page in deliberate strokes. Sebastian Kane. I placed the pen down carefully. The lawyer gathered the documents, sliding them back into the leather folder with professional neutrality. "It's done," he said. Victoria exhaled as though tension had finally lifted. Matthew stepped back toward the window, confidence returning to his posture. They believed the amendment was symbolic. A technicality. Something too small to matter. They did not understand the difference between noise and leverage. As the lawyer left the room and the door clicked softly behind him, Victoria turned to me. "I hope this doesn't create unnecessary complications later," she said. I looked at her evenly. "That depends on what exists." Matthew didn't respond. He stared out at the skyline again, as if the future were already secured. But futures built on assumption have weak foundations. My father's eyes met mine once more. This time, there was something unmistakable in them. Not surprise. Not regret. Recognition. He knew I had listened all these years when he spoke about precision. He knew I had learned. And as I stood there in that hospital room, watching my siblings relax into premature victory, I understood something with absolute certainty. They thought the story ended with a signature. In truth, it began with a sentence. One line added quietly beneath their confidence. One condition that turned silence into structure. And when the time came for that clause to be read aloud in a different room, under different lighting, with different consequences, they would finally understand what I understood in that moment. Never underestimate a sentence. They celebrated too soon. 3 weeks after William Kane was laid to rest beneath polished granite and controlled condolences, we gathered in the firm's executive conference room for the formal reading of the will. Kane Logistics continued operating without pause, deliveries moved, contracts renewed, employees unaware that ownership itself was about to shift, but inside that glass-walled room overlooking the city, tension sat heavier than grief. Victoria arrived first, dressed in black tailored perfection, grief worn like a disciplined accessory rather than an emotion. Matthew followed minutes later, confident stride, phone silenced, expression composed in the way of a man who believes outcomes are already secured. I entered last, not for effect, but because punctuality without urgency unsettles people more than dramatic timing ever could. The lawyer stood at the head of the long table, leather folder placed precisely in front of him. The same folder. The same weight. Only the stakes had changed. "Thank you for coming," he began, voice neutral, practiced. "Today we will formally execute the last will and testament of William Andrew Kane." My father's full name echoed through the room with gravity. Victoria folded her hands. Matthew leaned back slightly in his chair. I sat upright, hands resting calmly on the table, watching everything. The lawyer opened the folder and began reading from the first page. Standard declarations. Confirmation of sound mind. Appointment of executor. Legal formalities designed to prevent technical disputes. Victoria's gaze drifted toward the skyline occasionally, as though her thoughts were already calculating expansion plans. Matthew nodded once or twice at familiar language. Then the assets were listed. Primary residence located at, Matthew's posture sharpened almost imperceptibly. To be transferred to Matthew Kane. He gave the smallest satisfied inhale. Controlling interest in Kane Logistics to be transferred to Victoria Kane. Victoria's chin lifted subtly. Liquid investment accounts distributed as outlined herein. And then my name. A designated financial sum granted to Sebastian Kane in recognition of extended assistance. Assistance. Even hearing it again, the word did not sting. It confirmed something instead. Victoria's lips curved faintly. Matthew glanced at me once, measuring reaction. I gave them none. The lawyer continued. However, the document contains an amended clause agreed upon by all beneficiaries at the time of signing. The room shifted. Slightly. Subtly. The kind of shift you only notice if you're waiting for it. Victoria's fingers tightened together. Matthew's shoulders straightened. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and read carefully. All beneficiaries acknowledge and accept the distribution subject to any prior written agreements, documented financial contributions, and recorded caregiving investments. Silence settled heavily over the table. Victoria's eyes flicked toward the lawyer. That was simply clarification, she said lightly. Of course, the lawyer replied evenly. And as such, the firm conducted a review of all documented contributions submitted prior to execution. That was the moment. The exact second when celebration turned to uncertainty. The lawyer reached into the folder and withdrew a secondary file. Thicker. Structured. Indexed. He opened it deliberately. Over the past 10 years, he began, Sebastian Kane documented personal financial expenditures directly related to William Kane's medical care, residential modifications, property maintenance, and operational stabilization of Kane Logistics during periods of executive absence. Matthew's expression hardened. Victoria's composure cracked almost invisibly. Those were voluntary, she interjected. Family contributions are not invoices. The lawyer nodded slightly. Ordinarily, yes. However, many of these contributions were acknowledged in writing by William Kane, with reimbursement intent noted in multiple communications. He began reading excerpts. Emails from my father confirming temporary financial coverage. Signed letters thanking me for assuming property repair costs during winter damage. Bank records showing transfers from my personal account to preserve company liquidity during a supplier crisis Matthew had been too late to address. Dates. Amounts. Signatures. Structured evidence. Not emotion. Structure. Matthew leaned forward now. This doesn't change ownership, he said firmly. The lawyer met his gaze calmly. It adjusts equity consideration. Under the amended clause, documented financial and operational contributions must be reconciled prior to uncontested distribution. Victoria's voice lost warmth. Reconciled how? The lawyer turned a page. Based on valuation analysis, the cumulative documented contributions equal a significant percentage of the residence's maintained equity and a measurable stabilization percentage of corporate continuity during critical fiscal quarters. Translation: I did not simply assist. I preserved value. The lawyer continued, therefore, prior to final uncontested transfer, the estate must allocate compensatory equity consistent with documented contributions. The air felt thinner. Matthew's earlier confidence evaporated. You're saying the house isn't fully mine? He asked. I'm saying the equity attached to documented preservation costs must be reconciled, the lawyer replied. Victoria stood abruptly. This is absurd. He lived there. Of course he handled repairs. I remained seated. Calm. Handling repairs and financing structural preservation are different things, I said quietly. She turned toward me sharply. You planned this. I held her gaze. I documented reality. Matthew looked between us. You could have just talked to us, he said. I almost smiled. I tried, I answered evenly. Clarity isn't complication. Remember? Silence swallowed the room again. The lawyer resumed reading. The final outcome was not theatrical. There was no dramatic gavel, no explosive declaration. It was clinical. Based on reconciled valuations, the residence would either require equity buyout compensation to me or proportional adjustment in ownership structure. The company shares allocated to Victoria would require financial balancing relative to documented stabilization contributions. Structured. Legal. Enforceable. Victoria sat down slowly, the confidence she wore earlier now replaced by calculation. Matthew's jaw clenched, processing numbers instead of assumptions. What hurt them was not loss. It was exposure. They had underestimated the quiet son for a decade. They had mistaken proximity for passivity. They had believed caregiving erased ambition. Instead, it sharpened it. The lawyer closed the secondary file. The amendment ensured fairness, he concluded. Without it, these contributions would not have required reconciliation. Victoria stared at me. All this over one sentence. I finally stood, adjusting my jacket calmly. Never underestimate a sentence, I replied. The meeting ended without raised voices. No dramatic exits. Just the quiet unraveling of certainty. As we stepped out of the conference room, city noise humming far below, I understood something with absolute clarity. They had celebrated too soon. They thought the signature was submission. They thought silence was surrender. They thought one line was harmless. But structure, when aligned with truth, has weight. And now that weight was shifting. The quiet victory that lasted longer than money in the weeks that followed the reading. The Kane name remained intact in public, but privately the balance of power had shifted in a way Victoria and Matthew could not ignore. What unsettled them most was not the financial recalibration, it was the realization that I had never been behind them. I had simply been quiet beside them. Negotiations began almost immediately. Their attorneys requested valuation reviews. My documentation was examined again, line by line, transaction by transaction. There were no surprises waiting to collapse under scrutiny. Every receipt was traceable. Every transfer time-stamped. Every acknowledgement signed or recorded. Structure does not panic under light. Victoria attempted diplomacy first. She invited me to dinner at the house, the same house she had assumed would transfer cleanly to Matthew. The dining room felt different now, no longer a symbol of certainty but a space suspended between ownership and obligation. "We can settle this privately," she said, folding her hands with controlled elegance. "There's no need for prolonged restructuring." Matthew sat across from me, less composed than usual. "Name a number," he said directly. I looked around the room. The chandelier my father restored himself, the hardwood floors I paid to reinforce when water damage threatened the foundation, the study where William Kane taught me the difference between speed and precision. "It's not just about a number," I answered calmly. "It's about acknowledgement." Victoria's expression tightened. "Acknowledgement of what?" I met her gaze evenly. "That presence has value. That preservation has weight. That contribution isn't measured by appearances." Silence lingered. They had spent years equating visibility with importance. I had spent those same years building documentation. Eventually, they understood something unavoidable: litigation would only extend scrutiny. Public filings would reveal internal weaknesses. Investors might start asking questions. The quiet option was settlement. The house was appraised again, this time with structural upgrades and maintenance equity factored into valuation. Matthew agreed to a compensatory buyout reflecting proportional preservation investment. It cost him more than he expected, but less than prolonged dispute would have. Victoria negotiated corporate restructuring to reflect stabilization credits I had contributed during critical fiscal quarters. In the end, the company remained under her leadership, but not without financial rebalancing that acknowledged operational continuity I had ensured during vulnerable periods. The process was not explosive. It was procedural. Meetings. Drafts. Revisions. Signatures. Ironically, the same mechanics they once rushed now required patience. When final agreements were executed, there was no celebration. Just closure. Months later, the Kane residence was sold by mutual decision. The market was favorable, and division felt cleaner than continued tension. When the transaction cleared, the equity distribution reflected the amended clause's intent. Fairness. Structured. Enforced. I did not walk away with dominance. I walked away with balance. Victoria expanded Kane Logistics into 2 new regional contracts within the year. Matthew reinvested strategically and stabilized his portfolio. Publicly, the Kane siblings appeared aligned. Privately, dynamics had changed. They no longer spoke to me with casual dismissal. They no longer framed my years as assistants. They understood now that quiet does not mean unaware. One evening, nearly a year after the reading, I visited my father's grave alone. The air was cool, wind moving gently through the trees. I stood there without bitterness. Revenge had never been about punishment. It had been about correction. William Kane believed in structure. He believed in clarity. And in the end, clarity prevailed, not through confrontation, but through alignment of documentation and truth. I thought back to that hospital room. The hum of machines. The weight of the pen. The assumption in my siblings' eyes. They thought grief would rush me. They thought loyalty would blind me. They thought silence would cost me. Instead, silence gave me time. Time to observe. Time to organize. Time to understand that power rarely announces itself. It positions itself quietly and waits. I never shouted. I never threatened. I changed one line. And that one line forced a decade of unseen contribution into visibility. It converted memory into measurable equity. It transformed dismissal into acknowledgement. The greatest shift, however, wasn't financial. It was internal. For years, I had questioned whether staying had been weakness. Whether sacrificing momentum had reduced my standing. The reading of the will answered that without drama. Sacrifice without documentation fades. Sacrifice with structure endures. Victoria called me once after the final settlement cleared. Her tone was different, less superior, more measured. "Dad would have respected how you handled it," she admitted quietly. It was not an apology. It was recognition. Matthew shook my hand at the next board meeting without hesitation, grip firm, eye contact steady. Respect does not always arrive wrapped in warmth. Sometimes it arrives in recalculated posture. I built something of my own afterward, separate from Kane Logistics. Smaller. Independent. Structured carefully from the beginning. Because I learned something invaluable through that entire process, ownership is not just about assets. It is about authorship of your own narrative. They drafted a future where my decade of presence became a footnote labeled assistance. But they forgot something fundamental. I had been present for every draft. I had watched every revision. And when my moment came, I didn't tear the document apart. I refined it. One sentence. One condition. One doorway that required truth to be accounted for before silence could close over it. People often imagine revenge as dramatic confrontation, as raised voices and broken alliances. Real power is quieter. It is organized. It is patient. It understands timing. And when timing aligns with preparation, the result does not need volume. It needs validity. Standing there at my father's grave, I understood that the greatest inheritance he left me was not equity or compensation. It was discipline. Discipline to observe without reacting. Discipline to document without announcing. Discipline to wait without surrendering ground. They pressured me to sign. I signed. But I signed on terms that reflected reality. And in the end, the Kane legacy remained intact, not because control was seized, but because balance was restored. Money circulates. Assets transfer. Titles change. But respect, once recalibrated, settles deeper. I walked away not as the quiet son they underestimated, not as the caregiver they categorized, but as Sebastian Kane, the man who understood that sometimes the smallest line in a document carries the heaviest weight.